On the evening of the 11th of June 1972, an excursion train carrying families home from a day by the sea was racing through the suburbs of southeast London. Inside the carriages, passengers were settling into the journey home, unaware that anything was wrong. But only minutes ahead of them lay a tight curve at Eltham Well Hall station, a bend where trains were required to slow to just 20 miles per hour. That night, the train would reach the curve far too fast. The locomotive at the front of the train was travelling at more than 3 times that speed. Within seconds, the train would derail violently, killing 6 people and injuring more than 100 others. When investigators later examined the wreckage, they uncovered something deeply unsettling. The warning signs had actually begun hours earlier. The disaster had not been caused by a faulty track, bad weather, or mechanical failure. The crash had been caused by the man driving the train. Nearly 90 years before the disaster, a new railway line was carved through the suburbs of southeast London. The Bexleyheath line was first proposed in the early 1880s and built by the Bexleyheath Railway Company. Construction began in 1883, but financial delays slowed progress. Eventually, the 8-mile route was completed and opened to traffic in May 1895 under the control of South Eastern Railway. Like many Victorian railways, the line had been forced to follow the contours of the land and the existing towns that it passed through. As a result, some sections of track were far tighter than engineers would have preferred. One of the most challenging was located just beyond Eltham Well Hall station. Here the line curved sharply to the right. The bend had a radius of 12 chains, an old surveying measurement derived from Gunter's chain, a metal, flexible measuring chain used by engineers and surveyors. One chain equals 66 feet, meaning the curve had a radius of 792 feet, or about 240 metres. A curve of only 12 chains was extremely tight for a mainline railway. To pass through it safely, trains were required to slow to just 20 miles per hour. Over the decades, the railway passed through several different companies before eventually becoming part of British Railways in 1948. By the early 1970s, British Rail still operated trains along the route, and for generations drivers had safely negotiated the sharp curve at Well Hall. But on one evening in June 1972, a train would approach that bend far too fast, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Earlier that morning, an excursion train had departed Kentish Town at around about 8:30 a.m. On board were workers and families from British Rail's Midland region, based at the North London depot. Many of the passengers were railwaymen themselves, travelling with their wives and children on what had become a familiar summer outing to the seaside town of Margate. The train arrived safely at around about 11 a.m, and passengers spent the day enjoying the beach, the amusements and the attractions of the popular resort. That evening, tired but content, the group returned to the station for the journey home. The same train that had brought them there would take them back to London. It consisted of 10 passenger coaches hauled by a Class 47 diesel locomotive number D1630 with a trailing load of 377 tons. On board were driver Robert Wilsden, second man Peter Stokes, an 18-year-old trainee still gaining experience on the route, and guard H. Atterbury. There were also at least 130 passengers. The train finally departed Margate at about 8:13 p.m, running 8 minutes late. At first, the journey back towards London appeared entirely routine, but the chain of events that would lead to disaster had already begun hours earlier. During the afternoon, Robert Wilsden met his 2 brothers at the Cherry Orchard public house in Rainham, where he drank 2 pints of bitter and half a pint of light ale before leaving shortly after 2 p.m. He then visited his younger brother's home for lunch and spent time with the children before being driven to the station later that evening. His brothers later insisted he had consumed no further alcohol during that time and claimed he remained well within his personal tolerance. However, when second man Peter Stokes met Wilsden at Ramsgate, the driver reportedly mentioned that he and his brothers had shared a bottle of sherry. Shortly before departure from Margate, Willesden suggested stopping for another drink, and the two men went to the railway club, where they consumed 3 pints of bitter and possibly another half pint of ale before returning to the locomotive for the journey home. As the train ran through Gillingham and Chatham, Guard H. Atterbury began to notice that the locomotive seemed to be taking some curves a little faster than normal, although heavy braking at certain points appeared to correct the situation. Beside him in the cab, the young second man, Peter Stokes, had little experience of the Bexleyheath line and no authority to challenge the driver's decisions. The train passed through Rochester and Strood without incident, and Willesden complied with the temporary speed restrictions near Dartford, which suggested he remained in control of the train. Nevertheless, as the excursion approached Eltham Park, Atterbury once again felt that the train was travelling faster than it should have been. Concerned by the speed, he made 2 brief brake applications, known amongst railwaymen as splashes. These small brake applications were designed to primarily attract the driver's attention rather than significantly slow the train. Despite this warning, the driver made no braking response. The train continued towards Eltham Well Hall at high speed. From his position in the guard's compartment, Atterbury could only watch as the train continued to accelerate towards the dangerous curve ahead. At around 9:30 p.m, railway employee R.T. Ackhurst was sweeping the platform at Eltham Well Hall station when his attention was drawn towards an approaching train. Although the evening sky was cloudy and dusk was settling in, visibility was still good enough for him to notice something unusual. The train approaching the station appeared to be travelling far faster than normal, and even from a distance the locomotive seemed to be wobbling slightly as it ran along the track. Recognising the danger, Ackhurst dropped his broom and began waving his arms urgently in an attempt to warn the driver. But the train thundered past him without slowing. Seconds later, the train reached the curve that every driver on the line knew to approach with caution. On this night, it entered it far too fast. It was travelling at roughly 65 miles per hour, more than 3 times the safe speed. For a brief moment, the engine seemed to fight the bend. Witnesses later recalled seeing the locomotive swaying and lurching violently, its body rocking from side to side as the suspension struggled to cope with the forces pushing it outwards. Then the rails finally gave way. As the locomotive forced its way into the bend, the sideways forces became too great for the train to stay on the rails. Just beyond the end of the platform, locomotive D1630 left the track. The heavy diesel engine tipped onto its left side, throwing sparks as metal scraped against rail and ballast. Momentum carried the overturned locomotive forward, sliding more than 130 yards into a nearby coal yard, where it finally ground to a halt only a short distance from an electrical substation. Behind it, the rest of the train was dragged violently from the rails. The first coach jackknifed against the overturned locomotive, its front end crumpling as it slammed into the wreckage. Coaches 2, 3 and 4 were hurled from the track behind it, piling up in a twisted zigzag pattern as couplings snapped and the carriages swung violently across the ballast. Further back, coaches 5, 6 and 7 were dragged off the line but remained roughly aligned with the track before toppling onto their sides, their windows smashing against the ground. Inside the carriages were railway families returning from a day by the sea, people who only hours earlier had been enjoying the beaches and amusements of Margate. One of them was Phil Daniels, who was just 13 years old at the time. Travelling with his family on the excursion, he would later recall the terrifying moment that the train left the rails, describing how passengers were thrown about the carriage as chaos unfolded around them. Decades later, he would go on to become a well-known actor in one of Britain's much-loved soap operas, EastEnders. He also starred in the rock opera Quadrophenia. Many later described a sudden roaring crash, followed by a grinding metallic scream, as steel wheels tore across sleepers and the coaches slammed into each other. Lights inside the carriages flickered and went out. Windows shattered, luggage fell from racks, and people were hurled against seats, walls, and one another. One passenger later recalled that it felt as though the entire carriage had been picked up and thrown sideways. Another described the moment as simply a terrible noise and then darkness. Further back in the train, coaches 8 and 9 were pulled from the rails but remained upright, although their wheels left the track entirely. Only the 10th coach at the rear managed to stay on the rails. The violent derailment lasted only a few seconds. But when the movement finally stopped, the quiet suburban station had been transformed into a chaotic scene of twisted metal, broken glass, and injured passengers. In the darkness, the air filled with the smell of diesel fuel, hot metal, and coal dust from the yard where the locomotive had come to rest. All around the wreckage, voices began calling out for help. The first person to react was the railway employee R.T. Ackhurst, who had watched the disaster unfold from the station platform. Realising immediately what had happened, he ran to the station telephone and contacted Dartford's signal box, where signalmen began to take urgent action to protect the line and prevent any other trains from entering the area. Ackhurst then ran along the track behind the wreckage carrying detonators, small explosive warning devices placed on the rails that would detonate beneath the wheels of any approaching train and warn the driver of danger ahead. Back at the scene of the derailment, passengers who were able to move began helping one another from the damaged coaches. Some climbed through broken windows, while others forced open jammed doors in an attempt to reach the injured inside. The sounds of the crash had carried across the surrounding neighbourhood, and local residents soon began arriving to help. Within minutes, the first police officers reached the scene, followed closely by fire crews and ambulances. Rescuers arriving at the scene were confronted with a chaotic and desperate situation. Several coaches lay on their side, trapping passengers beneath seats and debris. Others had twisted under the force of the derailment, leaving doors and corridors distorted and difficult to access. Firefighters began cutting their way into damaged carriages, while ambulance crews treated the injured on the trackside and nearby platform. The work continued under portable lights as darkness fell. Railway breakdown teams from Hither Green and Chart Lecken soon arrived with heavy lifting equipment to help stabilise the overturned vehicles and allow rescuers to reach those still trapped inside. For several harrowing hours, rescuers worked through the wreckage of the overturned coaches. Some victims died at the scene, while others succumbed to their injuries later in hospital. Shortly before midnight, the final casualty was removed from the wreckage. By that time, the full scale of the disaster had become clear. 6 people had lost their lives, including the driver of the train, and more than 125 passengers were injured, many suffering broken bones, head injuries, and severe shock. In just a few seconds, the return journey from Margate had ended in catastrophe. Although the crash caused enormous destruction, railway engineers worked through the night to clear the wreckage. By the following Tuesday morning, a little more than a day later, trains were once again running through Eltham Well Hall. The official inquiry, led by Colonel J.R.H. Robertson, began soon after the accident and carefully examined every possible cause. Mechanical failure was quickly ruled out. The locomotive and its braking systems were found to be in good working order, and the track itself had not failed prior to the derailment. Attention therefore turned to the driver. During the investigation, the wreckage of the locomotive cab was searched, and among the debris, investigators discovered 2 smashed beer bottles. Toxicology tests later revealed the full significance of this discovery. Driver Robert Wilsden's blood alcohol level was measured at 278 milligrams per 100 millilitres, while his urine alcohol level measured 326 milligrams per 100 millilitres. For comparison, the legal alcohol limit for drivers on Britain's roads is 80 milligrams per 100 millilitres. Wilsden had therefore been operating the train with more than 3 times that level of alcohol in his system. Even more troubling was the fact that this was not the first time alcohol had caused problems in his career. In 1961, Wilsden had been arrested for drunk and disorderly behaviour, which included assaulting a police officer and causing criminal damage. He was fined and suspended by British Rail, although his suspension was later lifted after he promised that he would never again drink intoxicating liquor. Yet, in 1969, he appeared in court once more after being found drunk in Lewisham, receiving only a stern reprimand from British Rail. Investigators later questioned whether stronger disciplinary action at that time might have prevented the tragedy that unfolded in 1972. Colonel Robertson's final report concluded that the cause of the accident was clear. Driver Robert Wilsden, heavily intoxicated, had taken his train into the Well Hall curve at far too great speed, and the resulting forces inevitably pushed the locomotive and coaches off the rails. Responsibility for the disaster rested squarely with him, and he was killed in the crash that he had caused. However, the investigation also highlighted wider concerns regarding alcohol control, supervision, and operating procedures within the railway industry. At the time, there were few formal safeguards in place to prevent railway staff from reporting for duty after drinking, and the tragedy raised serious questions about how such risks were monitored and managed. Families of those who were killed or injured later received compensation through civil claims against British Rail, which remained legally responsible for the operation of the train. However, the railway itself was not prosecuted or fined. Despite the destruction caused by the crash, locomotive D1630 was eventually repaired and returned to service. The locomotive continued working on Britain's railways for almost 3 more decades before being finally scrapped in Rotherham in 2002. The events at Eltham Well Hall remain a powerful reminder how a chain of human decisions can turn an ordinary journey into tragedy. On that June evening, a train carrying families home from the seaside approached a curve that generations of drivers had navigated safely. But this time, the man at the controls never slowed down. And in the space of only a few terrible seconds, a journey home from the seaside became one of Britain's most preventable railway disasters, and 6 people never returned home. This is obviously a terrible tragedy, and it's quite close to home for me because I lived in the Bexleyheath area, and this train line was one that my mother travelled from every single day going to the City of London. At the time of the crash, I actually passed by the wreckage on a train, and I saw the carriages lying by the side of the rail, and it was just a picture of carnage. Those kind of images stay with you for the rest of your life. Our condolences go out to the families of the people who lost their lives in this terrible incident. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.